As I said at the beginning, I'm going to have the oak base on the bottom here, and I want to put a couple of rows of open segmented rings in there as well before I put this on. Now, just to show how accurate the measurements were, based on the length we were after, I was after a 90mm outside radius. So if we take the narrowest point, as in the centre point along these straights, and measure across there, I have actually got 90mm going across. It's about 91, 92mm here, so we're slightly oval shape. And for the inside, we then take from where the joins are, and that's going to be 65mm. So it's come out fairly accurate. Now for this, I want this to sit on a row below it. I'm just using these as an example at the moment. And I don't want them to be underneath to be the same diameter out. I want to bring them in slightly by about 5mm. So we're looking then as an 85mm outside. Now I've got some beech the same size as this from when I did the lighthouse project, and I've also got these strips of purple heart as well. So I think I'm going to put a beech row sat on top of the oak base, then a row of these, and then the closed segmented ring on top. Now when you work out open segmented work, you have to do it slightly different, and my spreadsheet does have all the workings out to do this, but you can quite easily work it out yourself. I will stick with 12 pieces per ring, and if I go onto that website with the closed segmented calculator for an 85mm ring with 12 pieces, it's telling me to cut the pieces as in this long straight edge at 23mm. So I'll write this down. So for an 85mm circle, we need to be cutting the long edge at 23mm. Now when you do open segmented work, you're obviously going to have a gap, which then reduces the length of these. Now the standard, as far as I'm aware, for when you do the open segmented work is that you have what they call a 30% overlap on the top. So it roughly means that these pieces you then need to cut at about 70% of the length. So if we take 23, that now means we now need to cut our pieces at 16.1mm. But also the other thing to think of as well is that these angles also change as well, because we're making the pieces shorter. If we still use the same angle, then you would find that they're not lining up properly. Now the easiest way that I've worked this out, to give an example, is that when we have 12 pieces per ring, on a closed segmented ring we will have 15-degree cuts. Now depending on what your overlap is on your open segment as to how much you've got to reduce it by. Now I've worked it out that when you do 12 pieces per ring, every 10% overlap you do, you've got to take 1.5 degrees off. So in this case I'm doing a 70% size segment, which is 30% overlap. So that means I've got to take 3 times 1.5, which means I've got to take 4.5 degrees off this angle. So it means I now need to cut my angles at 10.5 degrees. And I'm going to go back to my saw, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to roughly adjust it, and I'll just use this as a guide to take it down to 10-degree angles. So that is now roughly 10 degrees. The good thing about open segmented work, you don't have to be so precise as you do when you do these. It's there for more of a visual thing. So on the saw, I'm going to change the cut angle to this new angle. I'll change my stopper to 16mm roughly, and then I'll cut some of this, and I'll also cut some of the beech. Now that's all the pieces cut, and just out of interest, I'm going to see how far out my angle was. So they have come out round about 10 degrees. Now I've got to for these rings, I've now just got to sand them back like I did with the original segmented rings. Just sand all 6 sides. They're all sanded up. Now it's been probably about 20 minutes since I glued this up, did the final glue, and like with these, we need to make sure this is going to be totally flat. Now if you're like me, often or not, I mean, yes, I do have a bench sander which I could probably do this on, but I want to show the more sort of like manual ways of doing this so that you don't need any expensive equipment. I have a disc sander I can put on the lathe, but often not, I have a project on the lathe where I really don't want to take it out of the chuck, so it means that I can't use the disc sander on the lathe. So in this case I will go by that example, because I've got the base of what's going to be this segmented piece in there, and I've only got the one chuck, so it's because this is reasonably rough, I can feel that there's some deep patches on there. We just need to do one side, not both. I need to flatten that off, so like we did when we joined the two halves together, find the smoothest one and just backwards and forwards on a flat piece of sandpaper. Until everything is totally flat. Now the other thing you can do to make sure this is totally flat, a bit like I do when I put this on the lathe, is just chalk it all up. The smoother you've got the surface, the better it will look on the piece. See, I can still feel there's ridges there. And just sand it again, and when after do a few strokes of sanding and rotate the piece a bit, because you will find that you're pushing down on one side more than the other and you won't get an even sand. So that is now totally flat, ready to be glued. Now the best and easiest way to do open segmented work is to have an indexing system and a table which sits right at the centre of your work. Now I've got a video on where I made my indexing system. Now a lot of lathes do come with an indexing system. Some of them are pretty basic, that they don't have many stops, and the thing you have to remember is if you're doing whatever you're doing as a ring for pieces, you need double the stops. Now the table I haven't really covered before. The table, I made this ages ago because I used to use this as a sanding disc on the lathe before I bought myself a bench sander. And all I've done here, I've got a guide piece here which sits between the actual bars on the lathe bed, so it sits in there tight, and I've just got this bit of wood which then swings round under the lathe bed and just tightens down with a wing nut there. And so I measured this all out to be totally precise for the height on the centre of my lathe, so that when I do bring it up, it's right there in the middle on that point. And you also need some form of a stopper for where you're putting your pieces. Now these pieces that we put on here, I'm going to put the beech ones on first. We've cut these based on doing an 85mm diameter, so that's 42.5mm. Now again, I'm not being totally accurate on this like on some of my other work. 42.5mm is roughly there, and I just clamp that in place with a small clip. And again, it doesn't matter what you use, so then every piece will go on there. Now I've made this base totally flat for these to sit on. As you see, the pieces pretty roughly cut on the chop saw. They look absolutely fine, they're clean. This, we put a small amount of glue on the bottom. Don't want too much because we don't want too much spill out. Place it on in place and hold it there for 15 seconds. Right, that's 15 seconds, and then move. It's important you hold on to this piece as you bring it up away from the stopper, because it will usually catch on your stopper, especially if you use a thick piece there, and it will dislodge the piece. So I'll move around to 4 holes on my ring and then do the next one. And it's always worthwhile checking both ends of your pieces as you pick them up, because sometimes you will have a better surface on one end than the other. Now, when you do this last one, depending on how much gap you got there, it might not be enough gap to fit your table in. So sometimes you have to manually put the last one on, but because I've got nice big gaps there, I can still have my table up. And this time, rather than rotating the wheel round, the chuck round, like with all the other pieces, this is where it's good to have an easy mechanism to undo your table. I can loosen off the table and just knock it back out of the way. And that's those 12 pieces on. I find it takes me about 30 seconds to do each piece, so I'm doing 2 pieces per minute, so 12 pieces there, 6 minutes. I now need to leave this 15 minutes and then I can come back and work on it, but all those pieces are held well enough at the moment so they won't fall off. These have been left about 15 minutes now and they're on there nice and solid. Now the next job before I put on my Purple Heart open segment pieces is that I need to make sure this is totally flat, and the way I do that is mark all the pieces up with chalk. You could use anything that's going to sand away. Just a bit like when I did the closed segmented ring. We can see when it's not flat by what chalk is left there. And this is where you need a sanding board of some sort. It's just sand this away until all the chalk is gone. Now, all the chalk was gone. I've got one little piece on the edge there, which I'm not bothered about because they will probably get turned away when I do this all up. Just make sure there's no dust left on there, and I'll glue these on in exactly the same way as I did these pieces, but I've now got a very flat surface to glue them on. So again, checking which I prefer as the same side. Done exactly the same size pieces so my stopper hasn't moved. Now that's the Purple Heart ring on, and that's all the open segmented pieces that I'm doing now. I can leave that now 15 minutes. I will then get that chalked up and sanded flat like I did with the beach pieces, so it's then ready for the closed segmented ring to be glued on. And that's set for 15 minutes, and I can just do the same as before. That's now all level as before, same method, and the last thing I need to do now is glue on my open segmented ring, and that's the side that we made flat. So for this I just need to make sure that these joins go over the pieces, so I can just get an idea like that how it's got to be. Now the best way I've found to do this is if you put the glue on these pieces, you can usually wiggle this around a little bit until it gets hold, and that way you can just check by spinning the lathe by hand that they're all lined up and fairly central. Now the same as before, you don't need too much on. Just make sure you've got the flat side. Put it on where you think. That's already got a fair hold. If we're spinning the lathe like that, you can see, now I know this was out of round anyway, but I can see where it's more out, and that looks fairly central. All of my joins are in the middle of one of the pieces below. That just needs to be left for about 15 minutes now. I've left this about half hour or so now, so this is now fully set and just need to turn it down. So I'm just going to use my Ashley Isles spindle gouge just to take this down to the shape I want. I sanded this to 400 inside and out, had to use small pieces of sandpaper just to get in all the little grooves to take out the little pieces of sort of like the fuzzies on the insides and outsides. Gave it a couple of coats of spray lacquer, left this overnight, come out this morning, just gently sanded it back to 600, and I've given it another light coat of spray lacquer. Now I also just signed the bottom, gave it a bit of texture on there just for something different. This project wasn't about the making of this piece, it was really all to demonstrate how you can do segmented work with basic tools like a chop saw and nothing fancy, so you don't need a good table saw or a wedgie sled. And I've got to say that making this closed segmented ring came out probably just as well as I do when I do it on the table saw. So just spending a bit of time on there, cutting the pieces carefully. The only thing you have to be careful of with the chop saw is that when you bring your saw blade down and cut your piece, because of the stopper block, you usually need to let the blade stop before you can lift it up to take the piece out. Now, as you can imagine, there's all manner of things that you can make with segmented work. So those who have said that they would love to have a go but can't because they haven't got a table saw, please do go out and have a go. Really all you need to do is create yourself some form of a solid base. As you see, the open segments are quick and easy to do, and cap it off with a closed segmented ring. So spend your time trying to make a nice closed segmented ring, and for the open segmented work you really do need an indexing system to make it easier on the lathe. Your lathe may already have one, so just check how many stops it's got, because you will need double the amount of stops if you want to do more than one row of the open segmented work. and certainly create yourself a little table platform for it to sit on. It doesn't matter what it is, you just want something so that it's at the same height as the center point of the chuck, and then that way mark off where that very center point is. I'm just fortunate that the way I've made mine, the corner of the table is the very center point, so I can easily mark out at what distance I want to make the pieces. So it's quick and easy calculations that you can do to work out all of these pieces. And as I've said before, I do have a spreadsheet which I'll hopefully leave a link below that you can download. It's an Excel spreadsheet, so you will need Excel to open it. And I think there are several apps which will be able to open it, at least to be able to just see it. There's also online calculators. I've found ones for the closed segmented work, but you can work out very rough calculations to do the open segmented work as well. So hopefully this has inspired you to, at least if you're, as I say, wanting to do some segmented work and say that you haven't got the tools, it's shown you how easy this really is. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next project video.